Welcome back to here at Goldberg. Today we have to talk about an issue of immense importance, and that concerns the folks who go around with this tenacious zeal and fanaticism advocating particular talking points or beliefs and arguments, mocking others who they claim are one of the herd or sheep, and yet those very people, the ones who are all high and mighty, are inadvertently and unwittingly serving the interests of the political, financial, economic, and technological elites, just to name a few. So even though it's sensitive, as many issues involving cosmic intergalactic butthurt are, we have to have the courage to delve in. And it applies to different facets of society, so it's not just one group that gets the blame for this. And we're going to begin with the question of tort reform. So those of you who don't know, in the 2009-2010 healthcare debates, the Democrats typically were saying universal health care. A distinct minority suggested Medicare for all. And Republicans and conservatives responded with, no, we need tort reform, tort reform. The idea being that if you can't sue a hospital over something silly, medical malpractice, costs overall will come down. So marketed the right way, so that's great, that's a fantastic talking point. I used it myself at the time because I really didn't know better, and that's what the RNC told me to do. But of course, when you start looking into tort reform, you realize it's a more dastardly scheme. It is a company that wants to be able to absolve itself of responsibility for a very small sum of money in a settlement if they majorly screw up. It has very little to do with these frivolous lawsuits that are bankrupting the system. And of course, a frivolous lawsuit getting through the court system is a relatively uncommon state of affairs. You can file a lawsuit, that doesn't mean it's going to end up being successful. And even if you do win a large settlement, it's probably going to be diluted at some level. In any case, this is something that conservatives, or really business Republicans, have been trying to do for years. Under Billy Boy Clinton, they tried to pass it on the federal level, caps on lawsuits, and he vetoed it. So then they went on the state level, and they tried to get all these laws passed that limited how much you could get. That, of course, did not bring down the cost of healthcare. What that did is, let's say a doctor screws up and gives your child, their newborn, they end up in practically a vegetative state or have cerebral palsy, something that is like a really big problem, lifelong care, You go and sue them, you win a settlement, and the government comes in and says, oh no, you can't have that much because the state law says you can only get $1 million. Well, $1 million is not going to be good for lifelong care. And this is what these companies have done. They have set up the board to where they can charge you a lot of money, and if they screw up, they are not going to have to shell out a great deal. It is incredibly corrupt and immoral, but that's how things play out. And those are the stories you don't hear about. You hear about, the hot coffee being spilled on a woman's pants. That's the story, not the lawsuits where people actually got hurt and were basically taken advantage of by people who are lobbying the state legislatures. This is something even with credit cards, like the push for arbitration over use of a regular court system. What that means, whenever they send you out that new agreement, it's not just with credit cards, but almost any service you use. Oh, this is our new terms and conditions. Buried in there, there's something about arbitration. Why do they want arbitration? Because if you sue them with arbitration, you essentially have to work with them, and they usually end up paying out next to nothing. It is a system. The people who handle arbitration are typically, it's a model designed to help corporations. It's not good if you're the person who's trying to get redresses for something wrong that's happened to you. But again, in the common parlance of the middle class or working class conservative, all these frivolous lawsuits, all these liberals who are suing people for no reason, it gets more complicated, unfortunately. And you can read that book, The Making of a Country Lawyer by Jerry Spence, which I've recommended before. That gives you a good sense, and that's from a conservative Republican point of view. Or originally he was a conservative Republican, and he changed based upon what he saw in his practice of law. So just something to check out. You see this too with the 2008 financial collapse. Initially, when it came out, it said, okay, Wall Street was being reckless. They were doing things they shouldn't have, playing around, taking risks, and they messed up, correct? And then you started seeing this line of justification, I would say in the 2009s, 2010, especially as Obama took control as president, and it became where, oh, the fault was the government, oh, it was the loans to poor people, that's the reason why it collapsed. Wall Street could have been able to regulate itself if you just let them go. They're not going to make stupid decisions. First of all, that whole justification for the 2008 collapse, that it was because of the loans to poor people, has been thoroughly disproven. But even if you were to say that's true, why weren't these companies performing due diligence? You've heard the argument, oh, they were going to be sued by the EEOC if they were seen to be discriminatory. Okay. Find yourself a jurisdiction of courts that's pro-corporate, and at the time the Supreme Court was already pro-corporate, and say we shouldn't have to take this risk. Or self-regulate. Well, they were self-regulating. It's something called FINRA. And this is basically funded by Wall Street. They also funded the arbitrating agents for people who lost money. And those folks were actually, in many cases, if they weren't serving the interests of the Wall Street firm, they would lose their job. There was a big scandal over this after the collapse happened. But the FINRA was not regulating anything. FINRA was basically taking care of itself, its own financial assets, and not warning people what was going on and not enforcing penalties on Wall Street. Essentially, it is the fox guarding the henhouse type scenario. Even beyond that, though, when it comes to this question of regulation, Bernanke himself admitted that the Fed could have introduced something to regulate but did not do so. So again, it's not like the government had something in place to block it, and it was just weakly enforced. In fact, a lot of what the government does as far as financial regulation, ever since the 1970s, it is a voluntary regulation. It's an advisement. So they'd say, okay, you need to have a 12-to-1 debt-to-equity ratio. And Goldman Sachs would say, well, we can do 40-to-1. Or they're not going to step in and say, no, that's not allowed. And so you can kind of see how things play out in a negative fashion. Ultimately, these companies were committing fraud because they wanted to make money. And yet a lot of people, conservatives and libertarians, they go around shilling for the interests of corporations by trying to say somehow it's because of these loans to, lower income people that the system collapsed. Far more complicated than that, and Wall Street could have prevented it, but it chose not to. This is a good example of the problem. And even if we look at the issue more broadly, there's a lot of talk amongst conservative circles, the welfare queens, the welfare people living on the dole. But especially after the late 90s welfare reform, the likelihood that someone on welfare who's mooching, and I disagree with that, but even so, the likelihood that that person is having a very direct negative impact on your everyday life is next to none. I mean, unless you live near them, you live in a Section 8 housing development, you're probably not affected by the person who is, taking checks from the government. You might be morally outraged and indignant, and you should be, but let's be real, your welfare, your ability to live your life, they are not having a tremendous impact at all. On the flip side, people like this, Bond Capital, McCuxey Consulting, people who are actively coming in, and they got their nice fancy degrees from Harvard or Yale, and they're a management consultant, and their job is to dilute or destroy your pension, your healthcare benefits, get you fired if you've been there too long, you make too much money. These are the people who should actually be considered the threat, but because they are called a businessman or an entrepreneur, they're held up as these icons of success, someone you want to emulate. Those are the folks who will sell you down the river, but we consider them heroes because they've got a nice degree and they're all about making business more efficient, about growth, about saving companies that oftentimes didn't need to be saved, just needed to be managed a little bit better. And then we get to the question of immigration, and this is especially true with leftists, some conservatives, but mainly leftists. They say stuff like, oh yeah, we need more immigration so we can oppose racism. It'll help everyone. You've got that little dwarf, Tyrion Lannister, for the progressives, Robert Reich, and he writes really fast in his videos, and he says, oh yeah, I mean, immigration is good for everyone. It grows jobs. It helps the economy. Yeah, it's true that if you add more people to your economy, it will boost GDP. What they're not telling you is that overwhelmingly the benefits of immigration go towards the rich and the immigrants themselves, not the middle class, not the working class people in the country. This was very ably explained in the book The Age of Entitlement by Caldwell. That's definitely a book you need to read if you have any interest in current events or economics, because it's very eye-opening. Still more, whether you're talking about people like Mike the Cuck Lee with the immigration bill or with illegal immigration, they'll say stuff like, oh, immigrants work harder than Americans do. That's not really true. You can't actually prove that in any logical or effective manner. And as I brought up in my book, I cited the study, The Chain, about the meatpacking plant. The guy himself admits when they say the immigrants work harder than Americans, that is simply code for we can pay them less money. And yet folks will go around promoting this talking point, which could be to their detriment or their countrymen, because they think that it makes them, empowered or anti-racist. Again, you're playing into the hands of the elite, and the left right now is horrible at this. I mean, it's truly astonishing how divorced they are from the social democratic standpoint in shilling for mass immigration. So, never ceases to amaze me. Another area where leftists are really clowns is with the whole mask thing. Be a hero, wear a mask. Socially distance. Stay inside your bubble. Even if you have the vaccine, you still have to socially distance and have a mask. And the definition's constantly changing. First, the mask was only about not giving the disease to someone else. Then it's for also to prevent you from getting the disease. And then it becomes, the masks are useless, but you still have to wear them. And you're saying, what happened to the liberal left being about civil liberties, freedom, that sort of thing? It all went out the window when they decided to be morally outraged against the president. And it really makes you wonder, with all the snitching, with all the spying on other folks. If Fauci the entertainer, we're talking about, I hate to bring up Godwin's law, but let's say Fauci the entertainer, he were to come out, and I'm sure he's still going to be the point man for coronavirus under Biden. And he comes out, and it's 1930s Germany, but it's Dr. Fauci von Messerschmitt, and he's like, oh, there's a new parasite in the streets. You can see these leftist Karens would be like, Judah Vareke, without even thinking, because they get their sense of self-worth by doing whatever the CDC does, whatever they're told by a celebrity. It's like, you are selling yourselves down the river, and you're giving up your own freedom, your own privacy, and just your own dignity by doing all this thing of shilling for something, but which by all the accounts we have is not particularly effective. And I've even shown people the video of the nurse from New York, much of the other evidence, and they'll just ignore it. You are serving the elite. You are not a rebel. You're not part of the resistance or nothing. You're just a shill, plain and simple. And finally we get to, and this is a broad category of people who espouse this form and variety of individualism. Now most people in the West, if you ask them, are you an individual? They're going to say, yeah, I'm unique, I'm special, I'm independent-minded. But sometimes it's taken to an extent where there's no introspection. So people who are individuals all get together in a big category, groupthink, they're all espousing the same arguments, anti-natalism, retire early, just focus on yourself. It devolves into a sort of petty narcissism. And in the end, they're an individual in that they have money and they can be a good, able baker consumer for Amazon or Walmart. They're not coordinating or talking with anyone. They're not sharing ideas outside of a very small circle on the internet.com. And so essentially they have all this freedom, but it's freedom to be a slave, as I was talking about in a previous video. So always question what you're putting out there. Go to the source of it. Most of what we hear, what we see on TV, what is taught in schools, this has been filtered down by those who run the show for a very specific reason. And in some cases, it's not that big of a deal. But in others, you have to really start going, hold on, maybe you have been made a total fool. And you are contributing to the same problems that you believe you might actually be resisting.